Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In 1939, the U.S. Army began the production of the M2 medium tank. It was the largest tank in the U.S. motor pool at the time, and it featured a 37mm main gun and had 1.3 inches of sloping frontal armor. It looked like something out of World War I, and just over 100 of these tanks were manufactured before Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on Poland. Production of the M2 medium tank was immediately halted, and the archaic design was relegated to training tankers for this new strange modern battlefield that focused on air power and rapid moving tank columns and mechanized infantry. By 1945, in the last year of World War II, the U.S. military was rolling out the M26 Pershing, a replacement for the famous M4 Sherman medium tank. The M26 Pershing had a 90mm main cannon and 4 inches of frontal sloping armor. It weighed more than 2 times the M2 medium tank from 1939 and could probably take on an entire column of the smaller tanks all by itself. That is what 5 years of constant warfare and an arms race will do to your country's main battle tank. And this is what 500 years of life will do to Keanu Reeves. Absolutely nothing. The man is a national treasure and immortal. Now, during the Clone Wars, which lasted 4 years, the Grand Army of the Republic and the Republic Navy also experienced some pretty drastic changes. Today we're going to talk about that evolution throughout the war. The clones came out of the box as perfect warfighters. They were supremely disciplined. They could continue fighting until their bodies broke down. They each had 9 years of training in warfighting and tactics and were proficient in a wide variety of different weapons and vehicles and skills. They basically had the knowledge of hardened veterans, just without any real combat experience. But due to some genetically engineered limitations to their DNA, these clones weren't exactly the best commanders. Fight against them long enough, you'll start to realize that the clones are quite predictable and rarely went outside the box. This is ultimately why non-clones like the Jedi were appointed generals and commanders of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Republic Naval Fleet. But these Jedi also had their own flaws, like a lack of any strategic or tactical training, and so in the earlier days of the Clone Wars during conflicts like the Battle of Geonosis, it was very common for the Jedi to lead their troops from the front across massive open spaces towards a wall of enemy laser fire and defenses. We've seen this very idiotic style of warfare numerous times in human history, and even if this strategy does work, it usually ends in disaster for the offensive force. There's Pickett's charge during Gettysburg, the charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava, and of course Farmer's charge at Minas Tirith. The Battle of Geonosis ended up not being all that different. It was a Pyrrhic victory, and it severely shook the confidence of the Jedi and the clone troopers that followed them into battle. And it didn't stop there. Shortly after the Battle of Teth, General Anakin Skywalker leads a suicidal vertical assault up a cliff face against heavily entrenched Separatist forces. And then just months later, during the Battle of Ryloth, Ahsoka Tano also leads a disastrous frontal charge against a Separatist blockade with the majority of the Republic fleet's fighter coverage, which of course leaves their own capital ships vulnerable to counterattack. Now, the Jedi leaders who survived their own lack of experience and stupidity would begin to gradually adjust to this more modern battlefield they were fighting in. And so by the second and third year of the war, instead of just leading from the front and engaging combatants hand to hand constantly, more Jedi would learn to assess the situation and look at the entire battlefield, and not just the flashpoints on the front line. We see during the Second Battle of Geonosis a very familiar situation. The enemy forces are once again dug in heavily on the planet. Facing heavy enemy resistance, the Jedi this time managed to split their forces up and attack their objective from multiple directions. And although heavy casualties were once again taken, the Jedi generals were far more patient this time around, effectively creating defensible beachheads to absorb Separatist counterattacks. We also begin seeing the Jedi effectively use artillery support and also air support when pinned down heavily by enemy forces. During the Battle of Umbara in the third year of the war, we see a much more refined military force led by Anakin Skywalker. Using darkness and fog as cover, Anakin's 501st launches a very successful assault landing under heavy fire thanks to the assistance of mechanized scout walkers. When pinned down by enemy fire in a valley, Anakin calls in close air support to weaken the enemy forces, limiting the exposure of his own men to enemy fire. And by the last year of the war, we see even more impressive strategies being used on the battlefield and also battlefield adaptations. This includes the use of blaster-resistant riot shields in CQB situations and force-assisted maneuvers to help clones target weak spots in the enemy's defenses. Despite the fact that the Jedi were all about to be murdered by their clones, they ironically had become a very cohesive and effective military fighting force. The clone trooper and his blaster rifle is an iconic image. I imagine without his blaster rifle, the clone would not be able to do nearly as much damage. Surely punching a metal battle droid in the face won't do much but break your hand. In the first year of the war, almost every clone trooper was equipped with the reliable DC-15A rifle blaster. It could fire 300 to 500 shots per Tabana gas cartridge. It could punch through a droid's chest plate from about 5 kilometers away. It was plenty powerful to say the least. And in a worst case scenario, it was long and heavy enough to be a good bludgeon weapon. But the thing was almost 1.3 meters long. That's about the same length as the anti-material rifles used by our military forces, and just as long as a World War II era MG-34 machine gun. This is why we see so many clones fire the rifle from the hip and not even use its sights. Needless to say, this was not the most practical weapon to be used in a lot of different environments. The DC-15A was surprisingly light for its size, but it still weighed around 4.4 kilos or around 10 pounds. An M4 with its magazine in weighs around 7 pounds and an AK-47 weighs around 9 pounds, just for reference. While on the large open battlefields of Geonosis, the weapon's range and stability from a prone firing position made it an asset, it was basically too large and cumbersome to be used in a lot of scenarios like in urban fighting or other confined spaces. It was definitely not very useful within ships or inside of buildings. Shortly after the First Battle of Geonosis, the Grand Army of the Republic began equipping their troopers with Blastech's DC-15C blaster carbines. Internally, they had the same firing mechanisms and power as the DC-15A rifle, but they were about a third of the length and therefore a much more practical, all-purpose weapon. Although they lacked the same range as the DC-15A, they were far easier to carry around and aim, and they also had a bunch of different attachments like scopes and holographic displays that could link up to a clone trooper's helmet. You could even fire an ascension cable out of one if you needed to. Although these carbines were available shortly after the First Battle of the War, it wasn't until 20 BBY that we saw more clones adopt it as their primary firearm. While Phase 1 clone trooper armor was famously compared against stormtrooper armor with favorable results, it is also an extremely heavy and unwieldy piece of kit. It had been a product of Kaminoan design, and the aliens had little understanding of human anatomy and comfort. What resulted was a very protective suit, but one that severely limited the wearer's mobility. Other than that, the design was quite good. The armor plates were magnetically sealed to a body glove that included climate control system that also absorbed thermal energy from incoming blaster rounds. The plates themselves were made out of a plastoid alloy that did a relatively good job at stopping kinetic and thermal energy from incoming rounds. The entire suit was also sealed and pressurized, which meant it could also give the clones some protection against chemical and biological weapons, as well as vacuum and underwater situations. The helmets had a very distinctive T-shaped visor adopted from Mandalorian designs, which provided an optimal amount of protection and visibility for the wearer. Phase 2 clone trooper armor was adopted during 21 BBY, first by elite ARC troopers, then by the rest of the clones. It was far more comfortable than Phase 1 armor and designed to be far more modular and could accept a bunch of attachments and bolt-ons. The one thing that Phase 2 lacked was an internal life support system that Phase 1 had, although this could be addressed with an external respirator. Now, the one thing that the Grand Army of the Republic got right from day one was the all-terrain tactical enforcer, part infantry carrier, part mobile fire support, part anti-tank platform. It did everything reasonably well on those 6 legs, on the ground and even in space, throughout all 4 years of the war. But the Republic Navy, on the other hand, saw some very drastic changes throughout the 4 years of the war. During the Battle of Geonosis, the Republic Navy was completely new and untested. As a matter of fact, the invasion fleets sent to the planet lacked any real capital ships. The largest ships they had at their disposal were the Acclimator assault ships, which were essentially armed transports. So instead, the Republic relied on several wings of V-19 Torrent starfighters and Delta 7 Ether Sprite light interceptors to get rid of enemy defenses. It wasn't until later in the first year of the war that the Venator-class Star Destroyer would finally be launched and establish itself as the backbone of the Republic Navy. This was one of the finest ships ever designed in Star Wars history. Unlike the Empire's later focus on heavily armored and armed battleships like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the Venator-class Star Destroyer was first and foremost a starfighter carrier and could carry hundreds of different types of fighters. Although it could hold its own against enemy capital ships during close-range turbolaser broadside exchanges, it performed at its finest when it got a drop on its enemies and was able to launch its entire complement of starfighters from tens of thousands of kilometers away. The V-19 Torrent and Delta VII Ether Sprite were both produced during the pre-war era. Both of these ships were lightly armed, lacked ample defensive countermeasures, and weren't hyperdrive equipped and depended on hyperdrive rings for FTL travel. The V-19 was specifically designed with the Venator-class Star Destroyer in mind. It had folding wings, which allowed for maximum amount of storage space on larger carriers. After the initial success of the V-19 prototype, this starfighter was rushed into mass production. In the early battles of the war, the LAAT gunships used to transport clones were suffering heavy casualties against enemy starfighters and needed some type of escort fighter. As the war went on, we saw the introduction of the Incom ARC 170 starfighter, a much more complicated and well-rounded fighter designed for longer missions away from any support or carrier ships. At the time, the Separatist Navy was attacking multiple Outer Rim colonies at the same time, stretching the tiny Republic fleet to its limits. The ARC 170 was well suited for scouting missions, which could provide intel on CIS Navy movements across the galaxy at low cost. These ships were equipped with Class 1.5 hyperdrives and also heavily armed, and could survive encounters with enemy picket ships and fighters. Its wingtip medium laser cannons and proton torpedo launchers made it an extremely heavily armed ship for a starfighter. But during the Battle of Coruscant, the less maneuverable ARC 170 suffered heavy casualties in close-range night fights with smaller and more agile Separatist drone fighters. The single-pilot V-19 Torrent fighters and the V-Wing fighters would fare a lot better against these droid fighters, and they were also a lot less costly to build and maintain. This would basically change Republic starfighter protocol and design for the rest of the war. And ultimately, this led to the Empire adopting the TIE Fighter short-range interceptor platform over the more well-rounded Incom line of multi-purpose starfighters. The Jedi would also upgrade their Delta VII Ether Sprites for ETA-2 Actis-class light interceptors. The Delta VII, while extremely fast, were poorly armored, and their hulls were so thin they couldn't even accept full astromechs into their sockets. The ETA Actis II improved on the Delta VII design in many ways. The S-foils on the wingtips increased energy efficiency, which allowed the ETA Actis to field more weapons, including a pair of non-lethal ion cannons. So there you have it, guys. Those are some of the more basic changes that the Republic military had to make throughout the war. As we know, even the best well-written plans on paper will immediately have to change when they encounter real-life scenarios. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.